And as your co-host, let me welcome you to our dinner honoring Dr. Kissinger on the first publication of his memoirs in Time magazine. Now, as publisher, my role on occasion falls somewhere in the neutral zone between the editorial side and the business side. Maybe I should say the DMZ. But tonight is really the first time that I have literally been caught between the church and the state. So to you who have had difficulty getting here, in fact, some of you got here quite early, as a matter of fact, anticipating difficulty. But to those who have difficulty getting here, I apologize, along with my co-host Henry Grunwald, for any troubles you might have. But I hope you will, and I think you will, find it a memorable evening and one worthwhile. I would like to welcome, along with our other distinguished guests, Dr. Kissinger's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Lewis Kissinger. Thank you. And his brother Walter and his wife. Walter, are you? Can't miss Walter. Certainly Dr. Kissinger's wife, Nancy. And her mother, Mrs. Agnes McGinnis. Welcome, family. It's nice to have you with us, and thank you very much. Now, the excerpts from the White House years appearing in Time is an indication of the historical significance with which we attach to Dr. Kissinger's memoirs. And the fact that he selected Time magazine for this preview of the book is, of course, a great source of pride to us. Now, I can't let this occasion pass without mentioning a few of the people who played major roles in bringing this special publishing event to our readers. First is Ray Cave, the managing editor of Time, who put it all together in our pages. Ray. And to Ron Chris, the assistant managing editor of Time, who selected from the 750,000 words, the 30,000 that eventually will appear in Time magazine. Ron? Ron has a stump for a left hand right now, but he did an absolutely marvelous job. And then again, I can't let this evening go without mentioning Ralph Graves, who was our good shepherd on this project from the very beginning. Ralph? But as managing editor of Time between the years 1968 and 1977, probably no one journalist followed closer the remarkable career of Dr. Kissinger and the events during this amazing period in the history of the United States than your co-host, Henry Anatol Grunwald. Henry, of course, is now our editor-in-chief of Time Incorporated, and I couldn't think of a more appropriate man to introduce our honored guest than Henry. Henry, please.
Thank you, Jack. If there's one thing that can be said for Time Incorporated, is that we have a terrific sense of timing. And an example of this is the schedule this evening for the night the Pope's in town. I do want to point out defensively that we arranged for this affair before the Vatican had released the Pope's schedule. Nevertheless, I'm sure that there are a number of people among you who are experiencing quite a conflict of loyalty this evening, because I'm sure that you would like to be, perhaps, at Yankee Stadium, seeing and hearing the Pope. To those of you I can only say, who feel that way, I can only say that you may, of course, regret not receiving the blessings of His Holiness, but there's also something to be said for the blessings of this Holiness. Nowadays, I always find it a little difficult to know how to describe our guest of honor. To simply say that he is the ex-Secretary of State seems inadequate, especially as so many people don't appear to have heard that he is an ex. One could describe him as the Secretary of State for the government in exile, but that seems vaguely disloyal. If this were Britain, of course, he would be known as the Shadow Secretary of State. But even in the admirably svelte incarnation of recent years, it is hard to think of him as a shadow. So I think I'll get off the hook tonight by simply talking about him as an author. And it must be said right off the bat that this is an author who does not overrate the virtue of brevity. This may not be entirely clear to you from the selections in Time, but he's written quite a long book. I noticed the other day that someone had brought out a volume entitled The Year-by-Year Record of Human Events from Prehistory to the Present, and took something like 1,200 pages to do so. Henry Kissinger has taken rather more than that to tell the story of slightly over 4 years. A few months ago, some of the editors and publishers from this country and from all over the world who are involved in bringing the memoirs to the public gathered in the Time and Life building to talk a little shop, to talk about deadlines, arrangements, security, and quite frankly, to look after their quite considerable investment. One of our larger conference rooms was filled to overflowing, and as I looked around the table and looked around the rows of chairs pressed against the walls, I must confess to you that in my own mind, I could not help paraphrasing a rather famous line of Sir Winston Churchill's. Never in the history of publishing have so many paid so much for so much. As you can imagine, we took considerable pains in preparing these selections that are appearing in Time, and Henry in turn took considerable pains in preparing us. One of my own, quite seriously, one of my own mottos as an editor has always been the remark of Mies van der Rohe to the effect that God is in the details. Well, all I can say is that if God is in the details, he's learned it from Henry. As a matter of fact, I developed a certain quite unexpected sympathy for the chief North Vietnamese negotiator, Ly Doc Tho, when I realized what it must have been like to go over a treaty draft with Henry Kissinger. Speaking of drafts, may I pause to pay some special credit quite seriously to some of Henry Kissinger's associates who helped immeasurably, I happen to know, with this work, including Bill Hyland and Peter Rodman, who are here tonight, and of course, the lovely and brilliant Nancy Kissinger. I'm not absolutely certain just what Nancy contributed to this enterprise, but I am put in mind of the great P.G. Wodehouse, who once dedicated one of his books to my darling wife, without whose invaluable help this book would have been finished in half the time. However, I'm afraid I've reached the moment when I must be serious. The fact is, the truth is, that Henry submitted to our editing with grace and patience. The truth is that the book's length is fully justified by the subject matter and by the need for detailed documentation rather than mere assertion. Above all, the truth is that Henry Kissinger has turned out to be a hell of a writer. People who remember his earlier academic volumes or his necessarily careful communiques have been quite stunned by the style and drive that he displays in this book. The remark that I've already heard quite often since the first installment appeared is, "You mean to say he can write too?" I believe that White House Years is a masterly work, recalling Winston Churchill's History of World War II in range and eloquence. I realize that in saying this I stand suspected of a certain amount of corporate prejudice and bias. I hope that I have retained enough professional judgment to rise above this, but you'll have to make up your own minds about that. For the moment, let me just take a very few minutes to tell you simply what I find so striking about this book. It is not a humble book, but you may be surprised to find certain admissions of error and regret, which I think it is fair to say is a rather novel practice from this author. It is not an outstandingly forgiving book, but it is animated by strong efforts to understand the other side in one of the most savage domestic conflicts in our history and to achieve a ground for reconciliation. It is a book that shows a sharp and remarkably sympathetic eye for the public figures that Henry Kissinger dealt with, and a profound, often very funny understanding of the art of statecraft, the gamesmanship of negotiation, and the containment of bureaucracy. In short, the shop talk is terrific. The book displays an extraordinary grasp of the inner mechanism of events, which is why I, for one, found it truly suspenseful, even though we all know how the story came out. I was deeply moved by the book's devotion to America, that rare and very special experiment in history, which is so often ennobled and so often entrapped by its idealism. An idealism that, however misguidedly, led us into Vietnam, and however unhappily led us out of it. Inevitably, Vietnam is the most controversial part of White House Years. The book does undertake to defend a record, and as such it will be bitterly attacked in some quarters. The author seeks to demonstrate that widespread opinion to the contrary. It was really not possible to withdraw from the war sooner than we actually did, or with significantly less violence, except by paying a very great price in the coin of American influence and honor. And incidentally, honor is a word that Henry Kissinger uses without apology. I myself must confess that I have been in the past a skeptic on this point. But I must say that the book has convinced me. It will certainly not convince everybody, but any reasonably open-minded reader must be impressed by the argument. And indeed, after this book, the debate can never be the same again. At its most important, I believe the book is a treatise on power, and on that fundamental ambiguity which lies in the fact that to do good, one must use power, but that to use power is not always good. We Americans don't like ambiguity. We like all-out enemies and all-out friends. We see the world in terms of all-out defeat or all-out victory, having a very difficult time grasping the fact that there are no permanent victories and no permanent defeats, and that in the life of nations as in the life of individuals, it is our destiny to compromise, to maneuver, and to balance. Balance, as in the balance of power. That is a phrase that Americans quite unreasonably distrust, but it probably best expresses Henry Kissinger's view of the statesman's task and perhaps even his philosophy of life. For he sees the need not only for a balance of power, but for a balance of aspirations. And to underline my point, let me conclude by citing two very short sentences from the book. In a passage describing his meetings with a certain American pacifist, Henry Kissinger remarks, "Somebody has got to build a bridge between those who care and those who do." And contemplating the miracle of spaceflight in the company of his children, he asks himself, how does one dream in a technocratic age? How do a people regain the faith that caused small peasant societies to build cathedrals that it would take centuries to complete? Now, I submit that for a hard-headed practitioner of power, and for a veteran of some of the most bitter political battles of our time, that is quite a remarkable question to raise. Ladies and gentlemen, I am very proud to present to you the author, the witness to our times, the diplomat, the builder of bridges, the man who has done much and cared much and will continue to, Henry Kissinger.
Henry, Mr. Meyer, friends, and the man who posed for my picture on the cover of Time. I appreciate very much the rather excessive comments that Henry made about what is really just a very simple story of how I saved the world. It is true, the book covers only 4 years, and it won't really get exciting until I start going to school. I appreciate very much what the dedicated editors of Time have done to a prose about which a British reviewer once wrote, "I don't know whether Mr. Kissinger is a great writer, but anyone finishing this book is a great reader." If I may say so, this was the wrong point to applaud. I appreciated that Henry pointed out the dedicated men and women who worked as researchers on my book. You've undoubtedly spotted them sitting around this room. They are the people who are editing the menu. And running into the kitchen to make sure that what's on the menu is really what is being served. In fact, they don't let them go to church anymore because they have started editing the Bible. But I want to say a particular word of appreciation to Ron Chris, who has boiled down several 100,000 words into 30,000, and has managed to avoid any admission of error, because the first admission of error is on page 950 in a footnote. But if I can make some serious remarks. The writing of history in our period is an extraordinarily complicated matter. I think if the documents of a modern government were made available to the most objective historian, he most probably would not know where to begin. I started out writing history of the 19th century, in a period in which the diplomats were far away from their capitals, and in which they could be instructed only by being given some conceptual guidance about where it was that their government was heading, and what it was that it was seeking to do. And similarly, the diplomat could convince his government only by writing rather philosophical dispatches, analyzing the situation which he confronted. But in our period, in the age of the Xerox machine and of proliferating bureaucracies and of the teletype, there are no conceptual instructions anymore. Diplomats are told what to say, but not necessarily why. official files reflect bureaucratic struggles, but not necessarily the thoughts of those who make decisions. The most objective historian would not know what was settled on the telephone, what was dealt with by, at least in our government, the so-called back channels. No one knows whether a participant's account of a conversation is necessarily accurate or is an ex post facto justification. Dean Acheson once said that he never read a report of a conversation in which the author of the report came out second best. And I'm frank to say that I believe that some of the legislation, which is intended to make it easier to find out what is going on, and which is designed to penetrate secrecy, will, in my judgment, have exactly the opposite effect. Precisely because all participants now know that everything they put down is accessible to court action or to demands under the Freedom of Information Act. For that reason, what they put down is even more unreliable than the usual record keeping, if indeed they put anything down at all. I'm not saying that those who participated in events are the only ones who can write history, because their handicap is that obviously, if they were at a reasonably high level, all the decisions that are made at the high levels of government are closed decisions in which the pros and cons are fairly evenly divided. Obviously, they thought what they did was right, or they wouldn't have done it. And if they're men of conviction, they're likely to think they were right still, in most cases, a few years later. Inevitably, therefore, participants will find it difficult to distinguish between explanation and self-justification. But the one contribution they can make is to explain what it was that they considered significant. Which of the millions of documents that exist actually were taken seriously at the highest levels? Which affected decisions and which may have been written only for the edification of the author? This is not conclusive history, but it may help more objective historians later on to go through the otherwise unmanageable mass of material. I think it is important in our period because, for better or worse, it was part of my experience to be in high office during a traumatic period in American history. It was the period in which we had to make the passage from a time in which every problem that we recognized as a problem proved soluble, to a time when our resources grew finite in relation to our challenges. The last decade was the period in which America had to learn that the choice of our priorities was even more important than the mobilization of our resources. And the trauma of that period was the rebellion of our country against becoming like other nations. There was the endless American nostalgia that somehow we could sweep all before us by the purity of our motives, that we alone of the great nations of the world could escape the concern with power, with equilibrium, with contingent solutions, with problems that were only an admissions, whose solution was only an admission ticket to a new set of issues. Henry has pointed out our reluctance to face the balance of power, which you will find referred to in our history books, always preceded with some pejorative adjective, like outdated. And in the crisis that we face today, we have to understand that we will, in the 80s, confront simultaneously a challenge of power, a challenge to a philosophy of history, and an economic, and a challenge to our economic perceptions. We are moving into a period where in too many categories of power, the balance is shifting. And I know of no historical example where a nation that fell behind in significant categories of power did not have to pay a political price. There is no substitute for restoring that equilibrium. That is not an old world notion. That will be the reality of our period. The second challenge we face is the nostalgia that somehow or other the United States can lead the radical forces in the world, that we are the natural revolutionaries whom everybody should join. We are not the natural revolutionaries. Our revolution was of a different kind than that of the radical revolutions that are now dominating so many parts of the world. That illusion can only demoralize the moderate elements on whom we must rely, without winning us those to whom we seek to appeal. So, none of the problems which I have attempted to describe in my book could possibly be solved in one administration. One of the biggest challenges we face is to get some settled view of our national interest and of our long-term purposes. There's no other country in the world in which it would have been possible for a man with my background to achieve the position that I did. And in all the bitterness of the debates that I have, of the years in which I served, and among all the letters of protest and sometimes of hatred that were addressed to me, there was one criticism that was never made. Nobody ever wrote, "Who are you?" with an accent to tell us what to do. No one ever invoked the fact that I was not born in the United States as an argument. And having been raised in a totalitarian society, I could perhaps understand better the precious quality of the American experience. What separated me from the protesters during the Vietnam War was that I could not accept their proposition that we were run by self-serving, evil, designing individuals. I knew what America had meant to me before I ever came to this country. And I know that without America, there can be no security. Without our faith, there can be no progress. History can only teach by analogy. It can teach the consequences of certain actions, but each generation has to find out for itself which events are in fact comparable. Our biggest challenge as a nation now is that we are in a new period. In the past, we have been able to commit ourselves or withdraw, but we have not been responsible for the permanent management of international affairs. We have been able to segment peace and war into successive phases. But we now have to learn to conduct both conflict and the search for peace simultaneously, to maintain our dedication to peace and our dedication to our moral principles, to avoid war and not succumb to blackmail. And we have to arrest the decline in our relative position, which I believe is the inevitable lesson of our last period. This requires, above all, that we transcend the bitterness and the divisions, some of which I have had to describe in my book. We cannot afford the self-hatred which has cost us so much. We are going to be living in a world of great turmoil. But all great achievements in history have been a dream before they became a reality. No one coming from a distant planet, looking at the relative resources of the democracies and its adversaries, would conclude that it is the democracies that should be in difficulty. We are dealing with a system that has solved none of its problems. Not the problem of succession, not the problem of its economy, not the problem of its minorities. All it has managed to do is accumulate military power. Our biggest problem is to live in a world in which our assessment, we have to act on the basis of assessments which we cannot prove true when we make them. We have to react to challenges before they become overwhelming. Because if we wait until they become overwhelming, it will be too late to manage them. And I would say that that is, for example, the fundamental issue of what we have confronted in the last few weeks in Cuba, not the tactics of the number of forces or of how we present it in one speech. But this is not the occasion for an analysis of our current international situation. What I rather wanted to convey is that the period in which I was in office was a period that knew many barricades. What our country needs is to tear down its internal barricades and to begin to man those at which we are really challenged, and to put before the world the vision of its future and the dream that we can then turn into a reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kissinger, for being with us, sharing your views with us tonight. I think we're all looking forward to the issuance of your book in mid-October, I believe it is. I think we'll all be not only better readers after we finish it, but we'll certainly be a better informed people, and we thank you for that. At the conclusion, which is now actually, the library on the second floor will be open, and I hope you can join us there. Thank you very much for being with us.